US President Joe Biden says free speech and rule of law must be upheld in college protests over the war in Gaza. Student protests at universities in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza are growing across the United States. The war in Gaza has rocked the campuses of American universities. Similar protests are also taking place in campuses in Europe, where students in the UK and in France in response to Israel's devastating war on Gaza. The conflict has killed more than 34,500 Palestinians so far. The war began when Hamas-led gunmen carried out an attack in Israel on the 7th of October last year, killing about 1,200 people and taking 253 people as hostages. Now, to unpack the college campus protests, we are joined by political analyst and chief executive officer at HCCP Global think tank, Pascal Alain Handy, and associate editor of Daily Maverick and a retired American diplomat, Spector. Good to have both of you. Thank you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's a gorgeous morning in Brussels this morning, and I'm happy to engage in a spirited conversation with you on the future of free academic freedom.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So let me begin with you, Brooks, as I've got you in my sight of eye. What are your views on what is happening with these pro-Palestinian student protests at the US universities?
Well, I mean, rather than my views, perhaps my observations about what's happening and where it's likely to be going. Couple of points for context first. This is virtually the end of the U.S. academic year, and most universities will have their graduation or commencement ceremonies or events very shortly, and then there'll be summer vacations. Final exams are generally speaking over. The protests and what became known as the encampments took place at about 120 universities and colleges out of about 3,000 in the country. And the university administrators, for the most part, stood back and waited and watched. And then eventually, as the protests and the encampments became more permanent fixtures and began to generate a kind of pushback as well as demonstrations off campus. Eventually, in some places, New York and in California in particular, local police were called in to remove the encampments and arrest some, but certainly not all, of the protesters. And it turns out that in some of the cases where data is already available, a minority, but a significant one, of the protesters turned out not to be affiliated with the university concerned, either as students, faculty, or staff. Not a majority, but a significant enough minority as to have confounded the question of who exactly was protesting. Politically in the U.S., this has become very difficult for Joe Biden because, as your intro says, last night he said protest is part of the American way, which is undoubtedly true, but at the same time he said it can't resolve itself or devolve into chaos, disorder, and violence. What has happened for the Republicans in the case of Donald Trump and some of the others, they're arguing that this just demonstrates that Joe Biden has lost control of the country. So it's become something of political football back in the protests, the demonstrations, and the way the police have dealt with it. The other thing I would just toss into this mix is surveys of younger people countrywide indicate that the issue of Gaza is very far down the list of issues that are of importance or interest to young people generally. It isn't to say it's not important to some people, but it's issues like immigration, issues like inflation, economic inflation, and the question of jobs being available for graduates. And the environment, certainly, those are all higher up on that scale. So the political texture of the demonstrations, separate and apart from the issue of Gaza itself, has become somewhat more complex and confounding than some people might like it to be.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when you see the list of universities that are involved in this, the amount of students that are protesting, I mean, it's quite alarming, I must say, and it looks almost like it's, I don't know if one could say that this is sort of an organized protest, but perhaps you'll know better than me. But Simon, let me bring in you to bring in some of your views. I mean, just taking from what Brooks was saying, I mean, this escalating campus protest is really forcing the US President Joe Biden to walk a very careful line, obviously denouncing anti-Semitism, but still supporting young Americans' rights to protest. And again, to quote what he said, is that dissent is essential for democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder. So these are the kind of things he's dealing with. How are you seeing all of this?
I think what the president is saying at this point is really unconsequential. To me, and to be blunt and direct, there are two fundamental principles at stake here. First, this is an all-out, unprecedented, unacceptable assault on what has been held, in terms of the general consensus as academic freedom, freedom of inquiry. Secondly, the terrible blow to, American standing in the world and American democracy. First, as you know, it's been held for the longest time since the Middle Age. And again, in the 19th century, Alexander Humboldt, the founder of Humboldt University, reaffirmed those principles: the right of teacher to instruct and the right of a student to learn in an academic setting unhampered by outside interference. It included the right of academics to engage in social and political criticism. The fundamental criterion often premised on the conviction that freedom of inquiry by faculty members is essential to the mission of the academy as well as the principles of academia. What we have seen now, presidents of university, one after the other, incapable of mounting a robust defense of these fundamental freedoms, is really a massive failure of historical proportion. It always been held that the university is the sanctuary of deep, principled, profound intellectual disagreement. And the fact that from the bully pulpit of the Congress, decision can be made now on what people can say. Secondly, to conclude on that first argument, you can never police thoughts. It's always been held that thoughts are not policed. Mm-hmm. What you can police is the resultant action. And the brutality with which the police has been able to enter campuses, called by the president, really, speak to the entire universal academic community. Yeah. The second aspect, as a political analyst, which I say, and which is really, really heart-wrenching, is the terrible blow to American standing in the world. The fact that a foreign leader from a tiny country can actually order the president of the US to crack down on their own children really speaks volume about the waning influence of America in the world. And I'm not sure that we have actually come to truly appreciate what is happening here. But it's really a watershed moment that will have far-reaching consequences on how universities are managed and how America is viewed across the planet.
Well, interesting, because I mean, this is quite it's quite a difficult moment for the US president as well. I mean, we obviously at the heart of it all is what is going on in Israel and Gaza, and of course the US's stance when it comes to this. And some of the signs and placards that are being held up, and I'm just reading them in front of me here, some saying, you are funding genocide. This is obviously from the students there. Another saying, we will not rest until you divest. Another one, comment saying, we may be just a group of people, but we understand that we have support and we're standing in a movement that is all over the world. We're not the only ones fighting for what is right. There are encampments everywhere. So obviously this is not US-centered, but it seems that the most of attention is going to the US. How is this going to change US policy? Do you think something like this and seeing the youth standing up in these protests may adjust the way things are done?
Is this question put to me?
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, Brooks. Let me come back to you for this one.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just add that protest per se is not being inhibited on American campuses. Occupation of university buildings and permanent temporary encampments on university property has been, but you know, we've been here before. I mean, I'm old enough to have been alive and well and knocked on the head during a university protest during the Vietnam War. So I remember that period rather vividly, and that was police action in many cases that was particularly brutal. So far, at least, and my rough calculation is that there have been a few minor injuries in the midst of all of this in the U.S. Certainly no fatalities, and as far as I can tell, no hospitalizations either. How is it going to affect U.S. policy? I think Joe Biden, as president, is walking that thin line that you note, but I don't see the protests changing U.S. policy. I see the protests reinforcing the difficulty for Joe Biden in managing to keep a position that says, yes, we support Israel, and no, we don't support the kinds of actions that are taking place in Gaza. That's a nuanced position, and I'm not sure the president's managed to make that clear to the people in the country, or for that matter, to Benjamin Netanyahu. And as a result, Joe Biden, is being pressed on the left as well as by Republicans, for the most part, on the right. And his circumstances are, at the minimum, awkward, and at the worst, it may in fact become one of the reasons why he loses just enough votes in just enough states to not be president come November. But that would give you Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's position on Gaza is, if anything, much more strident and much stronger and much more embracing of Netanyahu than certainly Joe Biden has been. So it is much more nuanced and much more complicated than simply saying Biden is doing the wrong thing or Biden is doing the right thing, for that matter. This is a difficult moment for the president, but it also points to the fact that, just as you said, he's endorsed the idea of protest, even as he has declaimed the idea of violence. And for the most part, on most campuses, there hasn't been real violence. Just University of California, Los Angeles, yes, Columbia University, a couple of other places. But violence as a political tactic on campuses has actually been rather low.
Yeah, which is good to see for now, but one hopes it stays that way. One of the interesting things, I mean, obviously, as you do the comparison between the Democrats and Republicans, I mean, we saw Republican lawmakers like the House Speaker Mike Johnson actually calling on Biden to allow the National Guard to go in and quell these protests, and I imagine that would escalate tensions. So we'll wait and see what happens on that one. But Simon, on your side, you know, we look at what the whole idea of what this stands for, and some of the words coming out of protesters, whether we look at, you know, the European ones that are happening at universities in America, even in Canada, I mean, they're happening all over. One, and I quote this one because this was quite a very important word coming from one of the protesters, saying this sort of hypocrisy between what our governments say they stand for in terms of democracy, human rights and freedom, and the kind of actions that are happening, it's just not right, and what they are actually supporting in terms of Israel and Gaza. And I think this is what it all stands for. I imagine people are watching and seeing the situation out of control. The death toll is rising. Palestine is all but disappearing off the map. Simon, your views on this and the dissent that it's causing in different populations?
Yeah, I think that what is really missing in the picture here is the fact that as we speak, appalling acts of carnage are taking place in Gaza. And the slaughter of thousands of children, men and women, pales in comparison with the speech of a few students in American campuses. Again, I would like to reaffirm that unlike public speech, academic speech is only subject to quality controls by academic peers. That's the conditions upon which, the production of true knowledge can be ensured. So we should not be missing the ball. The focus should be for world leaders, especially the American political leadership, to focus on how they can bring to a halt the massacre taking place, bring the parties to the table, taking into account the underlying grievances, and find lasting solutions. It's not a crackdown on the students who are really the voice of reasons right now, calling for a common humanity once again to be championed. But I think there's been a failure of leadership, a wishy-washy approach on how to make clear-cut decisions on to resolve the problem. Cracking down on students won't do it. Preventing them from protesting is not going to resolve, the elephant in the room, which is how do we stop the bloodshed in Palestine and bring about a lasting solution that can help the Israeli and the Palestinian to live in peace and once again to heal that region from the century of hatred.
Right, gentlemen, I have to leave it there, but thank you. Thanks for giving us some of your views on all of this, and we watch to see how this develops. Political analyst and Chief Executive Officer of HCCP Global Think Tank, Simon Pascal Alain Handy, and Associate Editor of Daily Maverick and retired American diplomat book Spector, just unpacking and giving us a little bit of their views on the US college protests. But it's not only in the US, it seems to be spreading all over at the moment, Europe, Canada, over the war in Gaza.